welcome to Arts Express. This is Prairie Miller, and on the show, I saw Epstein Island. Pacifica host Garland Nixon goes on a vacation.
Good evening. My name is Garland Nixon. I've always got plenty to say. I've had an interesting, a person's got to take a few minutes to do something and enjoy themselves every now and then. And I went down to St. Thomas and St. John's in the Virgin Islands and spent the week down there kind of unwinding, getting myself together, enjoying the atmosphere. It was really a lot of interesting stuff. Boy, I could do a whole show on that. I did what? Now, here's what's something interesting. I saw Epstein Island. I saw it. I was at St. John, and I had a tour, and I'm going around, and the tour guide says, "You know what that is right out there?" I said, "What?" "Epstein Island." I'm like, "No." He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "No." He's like, "Yeah, that's Epstein Island right there." I'm like, "Oh, I think I see Bill Clinton." No, all jokes aside, I think Epstein doesn't own it anymore. But there was all kind of miscreant activity and tomfoolery going on there at the ruling elite by members of the ruling elite. In a nutshell, and this can maybe lead me into where I'm going. In a nutshell, we were, as I always say, we were lied to about Epstein Island. What was Epstein Island? What are we told Epstein was? He was he was a pedophile, right? He was some kind of a pedophile. Ghislaine Maxwell was his assistant, and they did pedophile stuff, which may be true. Certainly, I believe that. But there's another part to that you really have to think about, that I'm going to connect to where I'm going. Isn't it interesting that this man owned an island in the Virgin Islands? I was there. Man, you have any idea what it would cost to buy a home in St. John, much less the entire island? I would imagine you're looking at probably, I don't know, $1 billion for that island, $500 million, a bit. That's what you're thinking of for that island, right? That was his island. But he had another compound in New Mexico that was worth an unmentionable thing. And he had a house and all this money he had. And he was supposedly some kind of a money changer of some type. But there was never really any legitimate trail of money. So he spent money like Bill Gates or somebody, but he didn't have any legitimate income. And might I add, let's put a couple pieces of information together. When Alex Acosta, who was in the Trump administration, when he was asked why Epstein got caught in Florida doing the same thing, trafficking young girls, prostitution, and Florida pretty much slapped him on the hand. He got a year suspended sentence, weekends in jail. He didn't have to spend the time in jail. When Alex Acosta was asked, why in the world did you sign off on such a gravy sentence for this guy who did terrible things? And Acosta said, I was told he's intelligence. Leave him alone. That's on record. That is on record. His girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, her father's name, you might have heard me say this before, her father's name was Robert Maxwell. There's a book about him. You can look it up. It's called Robert Maxwell, Israeli Super Spy. Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a spy for Israel. Okay? Her sister involved in the same type of activity. In fact, her sister had one of these Silicon Valley tech companies that was funded by Bill Gates. Weird. So Alex Acosta said, and he was in the Trump administration, said, I was told leave Epstein alone. He's intelligence. His girlfriend, cohort, or whatever, Ghislaine Maxwell's father was a Mossad agent. One could suspect that Epstein was Mossad. And if Alex Acosta, a U.S. government official, was told, leave him alone, he's intelligence, that means he was also CIA. What does that mean? I don't have to put that together for you, do I? That the government of the United States, along with the government of Israel, was involved in the trafficking of young girls for sexual activity. Your government was involved in that. Now, one may say, well, is there any other, well, I don't know, anything else, Garland? Well, what happened to Epstein when it was possible that he might talk? They put him in one of the most high-tech prisons that we have because he's a very important prisoner. Because who knows, this guy could be connected to intelligence or anything. And mysteriously, the guards fell asleep. And wouldn't you know what a coincidence, at exactly the same time the guards fell asleep, the cameras went out. And as a third coincidence, at exactly the same time the guards fell asleep and the cameras went out, that's when he decided to kill himself. Isn't that just weird? So now he can't talk. Why do I say all that? Because the result of that is obvious, isn't it? It's really, really obvious. It's really obvious. But it comes down to a foundational belief of mine that gets me where I'm going somewhere with this. It gets me where I'm going. Okay? Goes back to COVID. It goes back to foreign policy. I could go on and on and on and on. I don't trust people who traffic young girls for sex. Do you? Do you trust someone? If you found out tomorrow that I was trafficking young girls or boys or grown girls or boys for sex, wouldn't you say, I don't trust that brother right there. He's up to no good. He's untrustworthy. Wouldn't you say that? And if tomorrow I said, hey, do this, it's in your best interest, wouldn't you say, I don't think Garland's looking out for my best interest. I mean, for God's sake, the man's trafficking young girls or boys or old girls or boys. He's a sex trafficker. He's a criminal. He's not to be trusted. Wouldn't you say that Garland is not to be trusted if you found out I was involved in such activity? Yes, you would, and you would be correct. You would be using your noodle. You would be using your deductive reasoning to say, I shouldn't trust this fool because he's up to no good. Yet, when our government says something about foreign policy, that guy over there in country X, he's the bad guy. Oh, that country's over there, they're the bad guys. We're the good guys. We're doing this to bring democracy to this country. We're doing that to protect the democracy of that country. We're doing that when these lying, thieving, child sex trafficking monsters do something. People fuss at me when I tell you don't trust them, they're liars. People look at me, oh, well, I don't know, Garland. I think you may be giving us propaganda. The government said this. And I'm like, that's pretty much particularly why you shouldn't believe them. That doesn't change when it comes to foreign policy. You listen to this show, you know that. I listen to people, well, country so-and-so did this. And my question is, how you know that? Did you study that? Did you look into it for yourself? You remember when people said, I want to do my own research, and they literally said, you do your own research, you'll die from doing it. Whatever you do, don't do your own research. I don't trust people to tell me don't do my own research. I can read. So all I'm saying is this. Do not discount your own ability and your own right to make decisions for yourself. Don't just let people tell you everything, and you assume that somebody else is looking out for your best interest. Let me give you an example. I remember when my daughter was in third grade. My daughter was a smart kid. And one day they called me and said, all right, what's going on? Well, your daughter's this and that, and I think we should put her in special education. I said, what are you talking about? Yeah, she's a little slow in this and that. I said, nope. No, well, nope. Where is your evidence? Show me what you got. Well, we've done this and this. They really didn't have nothing. And I don't know how much you know about the school system in America, but it's nothing unusual for young black children to get stuck in special education and then held behind. They then teach them slower, and then they say, well, they're not up to par with the other kids, so we got to keep them in special ed because they put them in special ed and they kept them there slower. And a lot of parents didn't question it. They just thought, well, they're telling me the truth about my kid. They ought to know they're the school. That ain't me. And you know what? My daughter graduated straight A's from college, University of Baltimore. But she wouldn't have if I didn't go with what I believed. If I just went by this system, they'd have stuck her in special ed. She'd have been behind, and by the time she got to college, they'd be saying, well, perhaps she could learn a trade, something she should do with her hands. Maybe she can be a maid. But I didn't trust the system, so I said, nah, we ain't going that route.
coming up next on Arts Express.
Well, 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 our war hero has arrived. You made a good choice coming back here. Son, I got a question. You like women?
That's my weakness.
I don't know what you said, but it must have been Indian for handsome devil.
Don't do something you're going to regret for the rest of your life.
I ain't got nothing but regret.
And those were scenes from Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon with Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio. But maybe not, at least some of the time, which brings us to the big reveal of our guest on the show, actor and filmmaker Larry Fessenden, who actually portrays De Niro and DiCaprio's voices on the radio in the film. Fessenden will face interrogation on those impersonations and more coming up, and discuss as well his current politically fueled one-man horror spree, which he wrote, directed, and stars in Blackout, a portrait of the artist as a moonstruck werewolf when not hunting down a different sort of predatory, small-town racist real estate vulture exploiting when not persecuting migrant workers. 2 movies, 2 killer moons. First, some scenes from Blackout, out now in release, then Larry Fessenden.
Hey! Are you all right?
Tell me, how did it all come to this?
I heard this noise outside the studio. I woke up in the woods, this big gash on my neck. Then I saw it, this full moon. I was separating from myself. That's when I realized I wasn't me anymore. It's been 3 months since that night, and every full moon since, on the night before and the night after. Total blackout. What'd you see that night?
I saw a monster. You seem a little wounded. What's really going on with you?
I can't say.
You're really a werewolf.
I'd rather be dead.
Charlie! Charlie! Stay with me, man!
When you realize what's happening...
Prairie, this is Larry Fessenden.
Hello, and welcome to our show.
Well, thank you. Of course, we have a long history together. I'm very tickled to talk to you again.
Yes, I'm surprised and delighted that you remember.
Oh, certainly. Always a favorite. And I don't know how far back we go, but it's nice to know WBAI is still active and that you're still active.
Hey, okay.
Great.
Now, Blackout has been described in a release as a, quote, werewolf film that puts meaning behind the bloodbath, a psychological beast of a monster movie. What are your thoughts about that description of your film?
Well, of course, every movie has to be reduced to a couple of sentences. So I don't mind. That's a challenge to the audience, that they're going to get a little bit more than just werewolf action, or maybe less. But in any case, the werewolf shares the stage with some thoughts on our society, where we are now. And it's about a small town in upstate New York that is somewhat divided politically. And so some of those issues come in while I still, I portray a character who is struggling with his affliction. Well, werewolfery.
Yeah. And a powerful addition to Blackout is the stunning and provocative artwork. Please talk about why you included that art.
Well, I wanted my main character to be a painter. And at the time, I met a painter, and he was so fond of werewolves and horror movies, and also was a very serious fine arts painter. And I thought this could be a really wonderful collaboration to sort of work with him to build the profile. And in the movie, I see the painter as moving from doing pastoral scenes of nature to sort of self-deprecating self-portraits. So there's a lot of art throughout the film when you see his psychological unraveling through the work that he's creating. And then additionally, when he's recounting to a friend how it felt to be a werewolf, I have beautiful painted animations by yet another artist. So I just wanted to sort of create that world. And one of my thoughts is that an artist is somewhat outside of society. They're already maybe a step away from the mainstream. And maybe that's the kind of person that would, in fact, be more open to being a werewolf.
And another component is the political inclusion of racism and land, property, and class conflict. Why was it important to you to include those elements in a horror film?
Well, that's the real horror that we deal with, our inability to get along. And when I thought about the werewolf, what is the nature of the werewolf? Well, he's a very divided personality. He might be remorseful in the day, and at night he's slashing people's throats. So it's sort of like the idea, there's a priest in the movie, very cliche, but kind of wonderful to do it in a modern setting. He says, a house divided will not stand. Well, I think that's true of our country right now politically, and it's true of this man who is part animal, part human. And so, the type of monster that you're dealing with suggests themes, and that's where it all comes from.
And as the writer of Blackout as well, would you say it's autobiographical in any way or based on any personal experiences?
Well, everything is, both my political concerns, my disappointment with humanity, and there's an element of addiction in the movie, alcoholism and that sort of thing, something I'm aware of. And then, so all my films are self-portraits, but they're portraits of what interests me. And also, we've discussed the art in the film. There's something I want to bring to independent films is sort of this tactile nature. We're having all these conversations about AI, and I sort of reject that. I don't know why we'd want robots to make our art. It's one of the only fun things there is to do in the world. So that's why the film is very handcrafted. That's also personal. So, themes, but also technique are very personal to me in my filmmaking.
And I wanted to ask you, what were you up to and why in Killers of the Flower Moon, credited as the radio voice for Hale, which is Robert De Niro?
Indeed. Well, if you've seen the film, it concludes with a radio play to sort of indicate that history is whitewashed and that it does matter how stories are told. So it's sort of a self-knowing moment from Scorsese, the director. And I'm lucky enough to be in that little portion of the film. And indeed, I play Robert De Niro and Leo DiCaprio's parts in the depiction. The radio play in Killers is sort of a recap of what we've just been sitting through as an audience, and showing how some of the story is distorted in retelling.
Now, Blackout also seems to raise the question about whether Charlie's artwork is an expression of his distress or an exploitation of other people as subjects to create his art. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, speaking of Killers, you could argue that is the horror movie exploiting the miseries depicted on screen, or is it trying to express that and give solace to the viewer? I think that's just an open conversation. I think I saw that in a review. Someone observed that Charlie paints his memory of a victim. And then the idea is, well, does that mean he's going to sell that and he's making money off of killing people? That's a bit of a stretch, but I like the question being asked. And that's what a movie should do, is offer you juxtapositions that then having to grapple with. So I'll take whatever the audience's interpretation is of all of that.
And how would you say, or not, that your film is derivative of prior werewolf movies in any way?
Well, it's using traditional storylines in terms of, the full moon. That is something we just assume now and associate with the werewolf, but that was only created in 1941 for the Universal movie starring Lon Chaney. So I like using the template that we're familiar with and then bringing in new themes and maybe even slightly contradicting what we come to expect. And that becomes a discussion really of like our assumptions about life and reality versus the reality of life and reality. So my movies are always dealing with mythologies and accepted wisdom and then sort of poking fun that things are not quite what they seem. And you can never be sure of the truth, your truth, all of these things, which are contemporary issues as well, obviously, with all the slippery truth out there.
And what are your thoughts about mining the werewolf genre for something entirely new, subversive, and unconventional with Blackout?
Well, then you just get down to being a weirdo. I don't think of my movie as being that. I think it's somewhat in line with the traditional werewolf story. But, I like that people feel it's fresh. I think it's just because it's taking itself. I don't make movies that nudge and wink at the audience and sort of poke fun at horror. I take it so seriously that it feels a little bit psychological and maybe disorienting. Like, is this guy serious? The voice having a werewolf story and seems to be taking it all so seriously. But that's just my approach. I always say, what would it really be like to meet a vampire, to be a werewolf, to create a Frankenstein? This is sort of my mission, to reinvigorate these cliches.
And are you contemplating a sequel?
Well, it's true, I am. I have to do one more with all the monsters, so that'll be a bit of a puzzle. How do you do that with a straight face?
And aside from being a universal horror tale, how would you say Blackout is a horror movie as a reflection of its particular moment in time, historically and politically?
Well, I think I've said already that it is a depiction of subtle racism and scapegoating and a divided town. And I think that's really the horror and the tragedy of our modern era. It's really an indulgence to not find solutions, but instead to find fault with your adversaries. And why are they adversaries? We're all in the same country. We presumably all want the same thing. So, well, the same thing meaning respect, dignity, and equality of some sort. So I just find it very disheartening that humanity has all these new technologies and that we're abusing them and abusing each other. So my films always have a little bit of anger and distress about the state of the world. But this is true of the arts forever. Shakespeare had his own gripes about kings and people in high places, and so and betrayal and ambition. So this is the job of the artist, to engage with our world and hopefully object.
And what goes into your choice of films, on the one hand as a filmmaker and on the other hand as an actor?
I just want to associate with people I feel are approaching the arts with care and tenderness and thought. So, that would presumably mean everybody. But I'm not interested in a conversation about the commercialism of something. I want to get right to the business of what is our purpose, to find a moment of truth in a scene. And I also do like working with young filmmakers because I believe in that initial impulse, which is why they get started in the business. And I'm calling it a business, let's be realistic. But, when you're young, you're still idealistic, or that's the dream. I think even that's being challenged because everyone's so self-conscious and self-aware. They don't do anything without knowing what the result will be and how their likes and their followers will respond. But, the dream is still to preserve the innocence of engaging in the arts, and that's sort of what I look for. Even when you're working with Martin Scorsese, that's the whole point. He remains youthful in his approach. He's still in awe of the craft and of the power of cinema. So, it doesn't matter how old you are, it's your attitude towards the work.
Well, what was it like being directed by Scorsese, and was anything a surprise for you?
No, he's just as you imagine. I mean, of course, as a cinephile, I've watched many interviews, and I know what he loves and the music he loves. So, you're very aware of someone like him. He's not a mystery like Kubrick might have been. But you're still, well, in any case, I was just delighted at how genuine he is, and that's how he gets that's how his films feel. They feel exploratory and still wide-eyed, and that's how he feels. He's just a very kind, serious, smart person. So it's a pleasure to be in his company, however briefly.
And why has horror been your choice of creative weapon in your life?
I like the question, or the phrasing anyway, because I see the world as through that lens. And I always point out that it's two lenses. One is the true disappointment I have in humanity's inability to get along, our insistence on destroying the planet, just the carelessness with which we conduct ourselves. But also horror has the great dark imagination that, Edgar Allan Poe offered us, and Algernon Blackwood and James Whale. And that is this aesthetic of a full moon, or a man who turns into a wolf. These are just aesthetic pleasures in a world where you can express the one's outrage with something imaginary and beautiful, like a monster. What could be more beautiful than Godzilla? My favorite Oscar at the awards was giving the special effects prize to the Godzilla guys. They brought their toys on stage.
What can you say about your upcoming role as Dino in The Demonatrix?
Well, I just got to learn the lines. I'm a fan of Voltaire. He's an old pal and fellow traveler. He's a goth personified and great musician, and particularly he's an animator and has done stuff with us. So he invited me on board, and I hope to bring Dino to life in some fun way.
And anything you can say about who or what Dino is?
Oh, I think I'll let the...
Oh, okay. And one last question. When Larry Fessenden looks in the mirror, what does he see?
It's funny you say that, because there's a lot of scenes in movies where people are looking in the mirror, and I say to myself, I don't really do that. I don't need to gaze longingly in my own eyes and sort of think, oh, what you've been through. I can only tell you I'm so much older than I feel like, and quite chubby, and it's all disappointing. So I don't spend a lot of time looking in the mirror.
Well, does it ever surprise you how the difference between looking in the mirror and what you see of yourself on screen?
No, there again, I mean, the irony of being an actor is vanity is almost your first experience, and then you either feel okay with the work or not. But I just find it's quite shocking seeing one get older. But, whatever, that's what it is. Yeah, I mean, acting is tough. You just hope that there's some modicum of truth in the work. That's, I don't know, the only hope, I guess. You can't be vain about it or you just wouldn't show up.
Okay, thank you so much, Larry Fessenden. It was wonderful to speak to you again, and thank you for joining us on the show.
Well, thank you, Prairie Miller. I had a lovely time.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
This is Comrade Karl Marx, and when I'm visiting the 21st century, I listen to Arts Express with host Prairie Miller. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win. Listeners of the world, unite.
That's Arts Express with host Prairie Miller, where art meets politics. And if you're down with the status quo, take the local.
And now on Arts Express.
I have to tell you something. Something insane. But true. about all of us. It started a long time ago.
They detected a sequence. Called it the wow signal.
What's it say?
They are coming.
Who are they?
When your consciousness ends in one world, it could continue to exist in many other worlds.
What do you think is happening?
I think we're at war.
This bitter earth.
And those were scenes from Three Body Problem, a controversial sci-fi dramatic series demonizing Chinese revolutionary history. So with Three Body Problem and the just-released anti-Vietnam series The Sympathizer, are communist Asians the new villains replacing Muslims? Or rather, the more things change. Arts Express Paris correspondent Professor Dennis Bro breaks it down.
This is Bro on the Global Television Beat, Breaking Glass. Today's episode, The Three Body Problem's Imperialist Problem. In Culture and Imperialism, Palestinian scholar Edward Said, in a magisterial study, details how the great works of Western literature are part and parcel of the fabric of imperial domination of the West, and in this case particularly Britain's exploitation of what is sometimes called the Global South. Said speaks primarily of the 18th through the 20th century, from the menace of Sherlock Holmes' Asian villains rematerializing in the imperial center of London, to the barely acknowledged Caribbean plantation source of the wealth in the Bronte novels. That mindset endures and is interwoven into the fabric of Western television entertainment, be it in the BBC One series The Driver, recently adapted for American TV as Parish, which highlights the savagery of the gangsters from the former British colony of Zimbabwe, to the supposedly more sophisticated treatment of another former imperial territory, China, in Netflix's spring TV blockbuster Three Body Problem. The series was adapted for Netflix by Game of Thrones creators David Benioff and D.B. Weiss from the trilogy by Chinese science fiction writer Liu Shijin. It opens with a scene not in the novel from the Maoist Cultural Revolution set in 1966, where one of the lead characters' physicist father is murdered on stage by Chinese Red Guards for refusing to propound revolutionary dogma. The daughter, Yi Wenji, body number 1, later goes on to become an astrophysicist herself, but in episode 2 makes a fatal decision regarding extraterrestrials based on her encounter at a labor camp with a female Red Guard member who refuses to renounce her participation in the death of her father. From the opening scene of revolutionary carnage, the series then shifts to the present in Oxford and to a group of physicists centered around a particle accelerator, body number 2, seen as the most advanced center of scientific development in the world. One of the Oxford Five group of alumni scientists and entrepreneurs, Jess Hong, then enters a virtual world. Her avatar is body number 3, which returns to the Chinese dynastic period, where she observes Emperor Zhao's territories threatened by a mysterious plague. She is appalled by this menace to the empire and wonders how to prevent it. We have here then a classic case of Said's culture and imperialism, updated for the popular entertainment medium of the 21st century, streaming TV. The Cultural Revolution, despite its glaring deficiencies, sparked proletarian literacy and was a first step toward the mass scientific breakthrough that has now led China to taking on the West in terms of technological advancement, to the point where its internet competitors, Huawei and TikTok, are both in the process of being blockaded by a West that cannot compete. The entire enterprise is presented as simply an exercise in savagery and intolerance, and is immediately contrasted with the material and scientific sophistication of Oxford, the representative of multicultural openness. Here, even its capitalist entrepreneurs in the form of Game of Thrones' John Bradley as Jack Rooney, a clumsy and likable practitioner of the art of streamlining jobs and work, i.e. firing employees, and the mysterious oil driller Thomas Wade are concerned with saving humanity. In order to find a positive view of China in the series, it's necessary to return to the dynastic period before the 100 years of revolutionary struggle, both democratic and socialist, which freed the country from the century of Western humiliation and the yoke of the emperors, a period which is here presented fondly. The imperial backbone should not come as a surprise from Bienoff and Weiss, who undertook the project after 3 failures. Left on their own without the George R.R. Martin novels, which they had followed through season 6, particularly the final 8th season of Game of Thrones, amounted to little more than battlefield carnage, with a disappointing ending in which Westeros does not allow for a progressive leadership. At that point, the channel HBO, flushed from the overall success of the series, was ready to make whatever they proposed. The team came up with Confederacy, an alternate history series in which the South wins its freedom and reestablishes slavery, an idea so patently regressive that because of the outcry, HBO was forced to reject. The pair then went to Disney, proposing to apply the GOT combination of imperial blood and sex to the streamer's key franchise Star Wars, which was also rejected. And so they found their way to Netflix, the most commercially successful streamer, which was more than willing not to reinstitute slavery, but to refound the imperial myth of the Chinese and global South jungle and the Western garden. The more things change. This is Bro on the Global Television Beat, Breaking Glass.
And coming up next on Arts Express.
This is a story that hasn't really been told.
Where do I begin? I've been photographing Asian Americans in New York City for 50 years.
All these events, and who do you see? You see Corky Lee taking pictures.
Hi, this is Jack Shalom. Photographer Corky Lee used to carry a business card with him which read, Corky Lee, the undisputed unofficial Asian American photographer laureate. And undisputed was right. His 50-plus years of documenting Asian American life in photographs, his knack for being in the right place at the right time, made him a cultural hero to millions of Asian Americans, particularly in New York City. A recent film documentary about Corky Lee called Photographic Justice, The Corky Lee Story is now in release, and I'm happy to have as our guest the director of Photographic Justice, Jennifer Takaki. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Jack. Thank you for having me.
Jennifer, tell us, who was Corky Lee, and why did you think it was important to tell his story?
Corky Lee was an unbelievable, unique person. He, for 50 years, had covered the AAPI community, the celebrations and the struggles, and documented it. His idea was to take these photographs that he felt were representative of the community that he loved and push them into mainstream media.
Corky Lee said he practiced photographic justice. What does that phrase mean to you?
So in 2002, Corky had decided to photograph Chinese Americans in front of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is in Promontory Summit in Utah. Corky had, in his middle school years, had seen a photo of the Transcontinental Railroad, the 1869, that very pivotal photo. And there were no Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, in the photo. And he knew that many of the Chinese had been working on the railroad and had lost and sacrificed their lives to make that happen. And so he knew that that was not correct, that somehow he would do something with it. He decided that he would start taking his own photos and making sure that Asian Americans were in the picture and in American history books. So for him, photographic justice was really when he was able to take that first photo in 2002 at the Transcontinental Railroad with hundreds of Chinese Americans. And then he recreated that same photograph beginning in 2014, which was the 145th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. And so for him, photographic justice was making sure that Asian Americans were seen and were part of that history that they were otherwise omitted.
Somebody said about Corky that he was always there at every event that involved Asian Americans in New York City, but because of his constancy, he was almost invisible. What do you think she meant by that?
It is so true that Corky was ever present. And as much as people saw him, I think they felt like they knew him, but they didn't know the personal side of him. You know what I mean? Like, because he was always there and he was always so talkative and charming, and he was always ready to talk to anyone about anything. But I guess you don't really know that you didn't know much about his life before photography.
The film really does do a great job showing his family, but I just want to get an idea of the whole range of events that Corky covered, because it was demonstrations, protests, holidays, and not just Chinese American holidays, but different Asian American holidays.
Back in the 70s, the way that the AAPI community kind of worked was everyone kind of stayed in their own areas. So if you were Chinese American, you hung out with Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Filipinos. And Corky was really starting to understand that the importance was kind of this Pan-Asian society, and he wanted to cover everything. He didn't want to just cover his community in Chinatown. He wanted to cross those cultural boundaries, and he did. He had to show and prove to people that he really was someone who wanted to do good. Back in the 70s, when there was all this surveillance with the government and this mistrust during the Vietnam War, and people were very apprehensive about anyone with cameras because they were usually used for surveillance. And Corky really kind of had to prove that he was part of the communities. You know, no one was used to having people film them like so regularly. And Corky just kept showing up, and people understood that what he was doing was important. He gained their trust, and he kept showing up.
What do you consider some of his most important photo shoots?
I do think that the 9/11, the Sikh with the flag wrapped around him, the American flag wrapped around him, that documentation was because Sikhs were being attacked for being mistaken as Muslim after 9/11. And Corky really kind of understood the importance of showing this group was really just existing in America when they were so misunderstood and there was so much mistrust. And these photos just say so much that these are Americans, and you know, they're not responsible for what happened in 9/11. Another photo that I know that Corky really appreciated was Vincent Chin, who was bludgeoned to death during the 80s because he was mistaken as a Japanese at a time when the Japanese were perceived as taking over like the automobile industry, and Detroit was losing all of its manufacturing business. He had this great photo of the mother just looking so distraught. She fought to the very day that she died to make sure that the people who had done this to her son would stand trial and really kind of face for what they did. But really what they ended up doing was just getting off for a $3,000 fine, which I'm not even sure that was even paid.
The movie really brings out that he wasn't just a photographer, but an organizer as well, wasn't he? He kind of started out that way.
That's a really important part, is that Corky was more than just a photographer. He started off as a community organizer in the 70s. It's actually how he even first picked up his camera. He was working for this organization called Two Bridges Neighborhood Council, and Corky was hired as a community organizer, and his job was to try to improve tenement housing. And the way he did it was he took these before and after shots. So tenement housing as it was, you know, some of them were in complete disrepair and people were living in the squalor. Corky would show that if you took photos of what was happening and you withheld your rent, that this is what could happen. And he would take after photos of, like, you know, people who held out, who eventually got the maintenance up in their buildings. And that was really kind of like the beginning for Corky in his journey to take photos. The first time that Corky was kind of really seen, like using his camera as a tool for social change, was Confucius Plaza. So Confucius Plaza was this huge building that was built in the heart of Chinatown. It was low-income housing, and it was meant to provide housing for the whole area of downtown. And back in that time period in the 70s, the construction business was a predominantly white person business, and there weren't a lot of minorities involved in construction. And so I know that the protests that took place were really just to get representation in construction work for, you know, the AAPI community, especially something that was so large and so vast. lost, and then there were no Asians hired to actually help build it, really kind of started this rallying cry in the community. And it was one of the first big protests back in that time period. And the result was that they did end up getting people hired. So that was a really great thing. But Corky's photos kind of helped tell that story. The other one that was a big protest in 1975 was the police brutality protest. There was a person who he'd kind of been roughed up by the police department in New York, and it became a rallying cry for people that this police brutality could happen. And when the community came out to protest what had happened, Corky had caught this photo of somebody else who had actually been, again, roughed up by the NYPD and took that photo. So it was a very pivotal moment for the community because it really kind of showed that the community could come out and make change. And again, because Corky was Corky, he was taking these photographs and then he was trying to get them into mainstream media. So he'd call all of the newspapers and tell them, like, hey, I have this photo. And it ended up on the front page of the New York Post.
And Jennifer, how did you first get interested in Corky and his photography?
So my background is in journalism. I wanted to do 5-minute vignettes on people who had a singular vision. I felt like anyone who has a singular vision is a really interesting person, right? Because it's like they sacrifice everything around them just because of whatever it is that they believe in. I didn't know Corky at the time, and I had randomly met him at an event. And I'd asked him where the bathroom was. And he's like, I'll show you. And I'm like, who are you? And he was like, I'm Corky Lee. And then he proceeded to tell me all of these things that he was filming. And I just couldn't get my head over why he did what he did. Because he wasn't getting paid. It was like this idea that he felt these themes were important, or these people, or, these stories were important. And so he would go out and film them. I just decided at that point that I would start following him. And 5 minutes turned into a full-length feature, like almost 20 years later. Like it took 19 years to finish the film.
Well, like so many of his peers, his outlook was shaped by the Vietnam War. And Corky was a conscientious objector, wasn't he?
Yes.
And Corky's brother John in the film tells a terrible story about the insults their brother Jimmy had to endure when he was in the army. Tell us about that.
One of his younger brothers named Jimmy was in Vietnam. And, one of the sergeants at the time had said, this is what the enemy looks like. And he stepped back and as, Jimmy standing next to him pointed to Jimmy. And that was such a moment when, again, like, it's kind of like what's going on with the Asian hate. It's like always kind of being the face of the enemy, not having the acknowledgement that Jimmy is an AAPI who is like sacrificing his life essentially for the country. And yet he's still being pointed out as being the face of the enemy.
What did Corky's parents think of his choice of occupation?
He had a very difficult childhood. I think his father was very stern in the sense of he didn't have time for Corky to want to be, toiling in the arts, or he wasn't that supportive of Corky wanting to be an artist in any right. So I think that for Corky, that was very difficult because he didn't have a lot of opportunities to be a child back then. He had to work. He had to work in the family laundry. He had to help cook for the family. And I think that, that just caused conflict between him and his dad.
Did he make a living from his photography?
He made a living in the sense that, like, occasionally he got paid, but he had to offset that with his job at the printing. He worked as a printer, but he did get paid here and there. It's funny because I was just having lunch with somebody earlier today, and we were talking about how Corky didn't do anything for money. So often people either didn't have the money or they didn't offer to pay, but Corky would be there anyway because he felt like whatever he was photographing was important.
Do you think that he paid a personal price for his obsession with documenting AAPI life?
See, that's something like I don't think I would be able to answer, but I do know Corky loved what he did. His brother, John Lee, said that Corky has a North Star, and the North Star would be that Corky was just that guy that was going to do whatever he needed to do to get it done. And he had this journey in his head that no one else understood. But he knew that these photographs would outlive him. He knew that these photographs were going to be important to AAPI history. And so that's just what he did. I think he felt tremendous pressure. I've talked to him about that. But also, I think because of that North Star, that was what his goal was, is just to get those photos.
Do you think that there was anyone or anything that he didn't document that he regretted?
I'm not sure that, like, I don't think there was anything in the past that Corky said, I wish I could have been there. I think Corky generally just wished he could have been everywhere doing everything. I think it was just, he couldn't do enough. And that's a lot of pressure for one person, right? Because in the film, he also says, if I don't do it, who will? And I really feel like he felt that way.
Aside from your wonderful film, how can people see Corky Lee's photographs?
We will be on PBS on May 13th at 10 p.m. Central.
Great. As we wrap up, Jennifer, what's the most important thing you learned about Corky Lee?
Corky was a person who so cared about his community that he learned about AAPI history through his own life and saw those moments that there was no representation of AAPIs. If you see those holes that are missing and whatever it is, that you can do something about it and just take that control. And Corky did that steadfastly. So one man can make a difference, and Corky is proof of that.
Well, thanks so much, Jennifer.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time.
I've been talking with Jennifer Takaki, director of the film Photographic Justice, the Corky Lee Story. This is Jack Shalom for Arts Express with host Prairie Miller.
I don't think people need to remember who I am. It's more important that they remember the images.
And that's all we have time for today on Arts Express, Expression in the Arts. And if you'd like to express yourself too, you can write to us at theradiogoddess@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Prairie Miller leaving the station.